A single microscopic insect can bring a multi-million-dollar agricultural empire to its knees in less than a week. In the sweltering summer of 2018, Kettering County's finest farmers watched their legacy turn to dry rot. Yet, amidst the devastation, one field defied nature because of a joke nobody understood. The smell of stale coffee and diesel exhaust always hung heavy in the air at the Kettering County Co-op. It was the unofficial headquarters of the local agricultural elite, a place where multi-generational farmers gathered to compare rainfall tallies, complain about equipment prices, and judge their neighbors' yields. At 32 years old, Clara Higgins didn't belong in their ranks, and the silence that fell over the diner when she unrolled her spring planting manifest proved it. Clara had inherited the family farm, a modest 1,500 acres of rolling plains, after her father William Higgins suffered a fatal heart attack in the cab of his combine the previous autumn. William had been a conventional farmer, to his core chasing maximum yields by drowning his soil in synthetic fertilizers and expensive pesticides. He had chased those yields right into insurmountable debt. When Clara took over, the ledger was bleeding. First Midland Bank had given her exactly 1 season to clear the arrears, or they would auction the land to the highest bidder. That highest bidder was sitting 3 stools down from her at the co-op counter, Harlan Miller. Harlan was Kettering County's agricultural titan. He farmed 12,000 acres of genetically flawless, laser-leveled land. He drove a customized King Ranch pickup, owned a fleet of $500,000 John Deere combines, and looked at Clara's rusted 1998 Case IH tractor like it was a contagious disease. Clara ignored Harlan's lingering stare and pushed her manifest across the laminate counter toward Garrett Dawson, the regional seed representative. Garrett adjusted his glasses, scanning the spreadsheet Clara had spent all winter meticulously designing. "Clara, there's a typo here," Garrett said, tapping a manicured finger against the paper. "You've got orders for hard red winter wheat, but you also put down an order for a heritage strain of turkey red and hairy vetch crimson clover radish. I assume these are for different plots, but your acreage totals don't match up." Clara took a sip of her lukewarm coffee. "It's not a typo, Garrett. It's for the same plot. I'm mixing them." The diner went dead silent. The clinking of forks against porcelain plates ceased. 3 stools down, Harlan Miller let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "You're doing what now, sweetheart?" Harlan asked, swiveling his stool to face her. "I'm mixing the hopper," Clara said, her voice steady, refusing to shrink under the weight of a dozen critical stares. "I'm planting the commercial wheat, the tall grass heritage, wheat, the vetch, and the radish all together, in the same field, at the same time." Garrett blinked, looking at her as if she had just suggested ploughing her fields with a team of unicorns. "Clara, you can't be serious. You can't mix a cash crop with cover crops and weeds in the hopper. The elevator won't take it. The combine won't know how to thresh it. The varying heights will jam your header. And the seed sizes, how are you even going to calibrate your air seeder?" "I've modified the metering rollers," Clara replied calmly. "And I've already spoken to a specialty miller in the next state over who is willing to separate and buy the heritage grain, while the vetch and radish will remain on the field to fix nitrogen and break up the hardpan." Harlan stood up his massive frame, casting a shadow over Clara's booth. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly pitying, which was infinitely worse. "Clara, your daddy was a good man. William fought hard for that dirt. But what you're talking about isn't farming. It's a salad bar. It's bird seed. You're going to create a tangled, unharvestable jungle of weeds." "It's called a polyculture, Harlan," Clara corrected gently. "The root systems operate at different depths. The vetch provides natural nitrogen, which means I don't have to buy your chemical fertilizer. The varying heights create a microclimate that traps moisture, meaning I can survive the drought they're predicting this July. Droughts are what insurance is for, Harlan scoffed. You mix the seed, you're going to ruin the soil profile. The weeds will choke out your cash crop. By July, you won't have a wheat field. You'll have a messy lawn. Tell you what, when the bank forecloses in October, I'll buy the plot for a fair price. Save you the embarrassment of a public auction. The men in the diner laughed. It wasn't a malicious laugh. It was the dismissive chuckle of veterans watching a rookie make a fatal, catastrophic mistake. They laughed because the rules of modern farming were written in stone uniformity was God. You planted one genetically identical seed. You sprayed it with one chemical. You harvested a flat golden sea of perfection. Anything else was madness. Clara stood up, leaving a $5 bill on the counter. She looked Garrett dead in the eye. Put the order in, Garrett. I'll take delivery on Tuesday. As she walked out into the blinding morning sun, Clara could hear the whispers starting up again. She knew she was risking everything. Her father's final credit line, a meager $40,000, was riding entirely on this single chaotic harvest. If her research was wrong, if the agricultural professors whose papers she had read late into the night were just ivory tower theorists, she would lose the farm her great-grandfather had homesteaded. But Clara knew something the men in the diner didn't. She had spent the winter analyzing her father's soil samples. William Higgins hadn't been farming dirt for the last 10 years. He had been farming dead, chemical-soaked dust. The biological life of the soil was entirely gone. If she planted a uniform monoculture of wheat this year, the depleted earth wouldn't be able to sustain it anyway. She had to force life back into the ground, and she had to do it violently. The sheer physical torment of planting the mixed seed nearly broke Clara before the season even began. Modern agricultural equipment is designed for absolute uniformity. Her rusted Case Wine H air seeder was built to dispense millions of identical pellets at the exact same depth and spacing. Pouring her chaotic mix into the massive steel hopper was a mechanical nightmare. The large, fuzzy seeds of the hairy vetch clumped together. The tiny, pepper-like radish seeds sifted to the bottom. The commercial wheat and the heritage turkey. Red wheat had different weights, causing the pneumatic tubes to choke and sputter. For 3 agonizing weeks in April, Clara practically lived in the cab of her tractor. She was forced to stop every 2 hours, climb out into the biting spring wind, and use a steel rod to manually unclog the distribution hoses. Her knuckles bled from constantly adjusting the mechanical shims she had fabricated out of duct tape and plastic. She ran on 4 hours of sleep, a night surviving on cold black coffee and stale sandwiches. Across the property line, Harlan Miller's planting operation was a symphony of modern technology. His massive GPS-guided rigs glided across the earth with pinpoint accuracy, planting perfect, mathematically flawless rows of genetically modified wheat. His operation was finished in 5 days. Harlan even drove his pickup to the property line one evening, leaning against the hood, simply watching Clara, covered in grease, wrestling with her jammed seeder in the fading light. He didn't offer to help. He just watched the disaster unfold with a grim, knowing smile. By late May, the visual contrast between the 2 farms became the talk of Kettering County. Harlan's fields were a masterpiece of conventional agriculture. Millions of emerald-green stalks pushed out of the dark earth uniform in height, down to the millimeter. Looking at Harlan's farm was like looking at an endless, perfectly manicured golf course. Not a single weed dared to break the canopy. It was beautiful sterile and highly profitable. Clara's fields, on the other hand, looked like an abandoned lot. When her seeds finally sprouted, it was an eruption of absolute chaos. The commercial wheat came up first, a standard pale green, but then the heritage turkey, Red wheat shot up past it, growing tall and spindly, swaying wildly in the wind. Beneath the wheat, the broad, aggressive leaves of the daikon radishes fractured the soil crust, and the hairy vetch began to creep and vine its way along the ground, tangling around the base of the wheat stalks like a green, suffocating carpet. It looked dirty. It looked out of control. People began driving down County Road 9 just to point and stare. A local agricultural vlogger, a kid named Tyler who flew drones over farms for his YouTube channel, posted a video titled, "How to Ruin 1,500 Acres in 30 Days." He flew his drone right down the property line, showing the stark, jarring contrast between Harlan's pristine emerald sea and Clara's uneven, multicolored jungle. The comment section was ruthless, filled with old-timers declaring that Clara's father would be spinning in his grave. Even Clara had moments of sheer panic. Standing at the edge of her field in early June, watching the vetch climb the stalks of her cash crop, she felt a sickening wave of doubt. The field looked impenetrable. How was she going to get a combine header through that mess in August? Had she just sabotaged her own machinery? Had she let her stubborn pride destroy her family's legacy? But when she knelt down and thrust her bare hands into the dirt, the panic subsided. Beneath the chaotic canopy, the soil was cool and damp. Despite the fact that it hadn't rained in 14 days, the thick ground cover of the vetch had trapped the morning dew, shielding the earth from the baking sun. When Clara pulled up a handful of dirt, it wasn't the dry, dusty powder her father used to kick in frustration. It was dark, it clumped together, and it smelled rich and sweet. Earthworms, creatures Clara hadn't seen in this soil in over a decade, writhed blindly in her palm. The chaotic mess above ground was creating a thriving, aggressive ecosystem below it. She just had to hold on until harvest. But nature had other plans. The heat wave hit in the second week of June, a suffocating, windless dome of high pressure that settled over the Midwest. The temperature skyrocketed to 104 degrees and stayed there. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, and with the oppressive heat came a warning from the State Agricultural Extension Office. Dr. Aris Bowman, the county agronomist, sent out an emergency SMS blast to every registered farmer in Kettering County at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Clara read the text on her cracked phone screen while standing in her kitchen. Urgent severe infestation of bronze wheat borer, confirmed 3 counties north. Mutation detected. Pest is highly aggressive and moving south rapidly on upper-level winds. Conventional organophosphates showing less than 30% efficacy. Scout your fields immediately. Prepare for immediate aerial application. The bronze wheat borer was a nightmare pest. It was a tiny armored insect that laid its eggs at the base of the wheat stalk. When the larvae hatched, they burrowed upward inside the stem, hollowing out the plant from the inside. A farmer wouldn't even know they were there until the wind blew and the weakened stalks simply snapped in half, collapsing the entire crop overnight. By noon, the horizon was buzzing with the sound of crop dusters. Harlan Miller wasn't taking any chances. He had contracted 3 aircraft to fly in tight formation over his 12,000 acres, dumping thousands of gallons of heavy chemical neurotoxins onto his pristine fields. The smell of the pesticides drifted across the property line, sharp and metallic, burning the back of Clara's throat. Garrett Dawson pulled his company truck into Clara's driveway an hour later. He looked frantic, his usual slick demeanor replaced by genuine panic. "Clara, I can get a plane over your fields by tomorrow morning," Garrett said, slamming his truck door. "It's going to cost you 20 grand, and you'll have to sign a promissory note, but the bank will back it under emergency provisions. You have to spray right now. This borer variant is wiping out everything in its path." Clara stood on her porch, looking out at her wild, tangled fields, then over at Harlan's chemically drenched land. She thought about her bank account, currently sitting at -$400. She thought about the earthworms she had held in her hand. "No," Clara said quietly. "Clara, listen to me," Garrett pleaded, stepping onto the porch. "This isn't the time to be stubborn. The borer thrives in monocultures, yes, but it will eat your wheat, too. The chemical is the only shield you have. If you don't spray, they will devour your stems, and you will have 0 yield. 0. "If I spray," Clara replied, "I kill the predatory wasps and the ladybugs that are currently living in the vetch. I kill the ecosystem I just spent 2 months building. And if the chemical only has a 30% efficacy rate anyway, I'm just bankrupting myself to poison my own dirt." Garrett stared at her horrified. "You're committing suicide. You are literally just handing the keys of this farm to Harlan Miller." "I'm not spraying, Garrett. Cancel the plane." Word spread through Kettering County before nightfall. Clara Higgins wasn't just planting weeds, she was refusing to protect her borders. In a county where a pest outbreak was viewed as a communal threat, Clara's refusal to spray was seen as an act of treason. Harlan Miller made a furious phone call to the county commissioner, demanding Clara be forced to spray under nuisance laws, but there was no legal precedent to force a farmer to apply chemicals. Clara was isolated. She locked her doors, ignored the ringing phone, and watched the hazy summer sky. 3 days later, the wind shifted, blowing down from the north, and the swarm arrived. The swarm did not look like a biblical plague. It looked like a trick of the light. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon as a shimmering metallic haze on the northern horizon, carried southward by the relentless baking winds. By nightfall, the bronze wheat borer had settled over Kettering County like an invisible shroud. For the first 4 days, Harlan Miller's fields looked invincible. The heavy organophosphates he had paid top dollar to spray had left a toxic residue on the wheat canopy. When the first wave of adult borers landed, millions of them died instantly, their tiny armored bodies raining down onto the sterile dirt between the perfectly spaced rows. Harlan even gave an interview to the local agricultural radio station, boasting about the swift, decisive power of modern chemical management. But Dr. Aris Bowman's warning had been entirely accurate. This was a mutation, and the chemical efficacy was dreadfully low. The neurotoxin had only killed the weakest of the swarm. The survivors, the robust, chemically resistant fraction of the invaders, crawled down to the base of Harlan's wheat stalks and began to lay their eggs. Because Harlan had maintained a flawless weed-free monoculture, there were no predator insects left in his fields. He had annihilated the ladybugs, the lacewings, and the parasitic wasps weeks ago with his routine preventative spraying. The borer larvae hatched into a buffet completely devoid of natural enemies. They burrowed into the stems of Harlan's genetically identical wheat and began to eat. For Clara, those same 4 days were an agonizing exercise in blind faith. She walked her tangled, chaotic fields every morning at dawn, her boots soaking wet from the dew, trapped by the hairy vetch. She found the metallic adult borers on the leaves of her tall, turkey red wheat. Her heart would hammer against her ribs as she watched them crawl toward the stalks. But then the chaos of her polyculture went to work. The bronze wheat borer, hunted primarily by chemical receptors, they smelled the uniform, unbroken scent of a commercial wheat field. Clara's field, however, was an olfactory nightmare for the pests. The sharp, spicy chemical compounds released by the broad daikon radish leaves masked the scent of the wheat. The invasive insects flew in disoriented, erratic circles, unable to find the dense concentration of host plants they required to trigger mass reproduction. More importantly, the bugs that did manage to find Clara's wheat were met with a savage entrenched army. The thick creeping vetch had provided a cool, humid sanctuary for thousands of predatory ground beetles and parasitic bracconid wasps. Clara watched in stunned fascination one morning as a tiny black wasp landed directly on a borer larva that was attempting to chew into a stalk. The wasp quickly injected its own eggs inside the borer, turning the pest into a living incubator that would eventually be consumed from the inside out. Nature was fighting Clara's war for her violently and efficiently. The real devastation across Kettering County remained hidden until the third week of July. That was when the summer storms finally broke the heat wave. A violent line of thunderstorms rolled off the plains, bringing heavy rain and 60-mile-per-hour straight-line winds. Clara stood on her porch at midnight, listening to the wind howl around the eaves of her farmhouse. She knew what wind like this meant for weakened grain. If the borers had hollowed out her stalks, the entire crop would be flattened by morning, a catastrophic condition known as lodging, from which there was no recovery. A combine cannot harvest wheat that is plastered flat against the mud. When the sun rose the next morning, the sky was a bruised, vibrant purple. Clara drove her rusted farm truck to the county line, where her property met Harlan's. Harlan Miller was already there. His customized King Ranch pickup was parked haphazardly in the ditch. Harlan was standing 50 yards out into his own field, his shoulders slumped, staring down at the earth. Clara killed the engine and stepped out. The smell of rotting vegetation hit her immediately. Harlan's 12,000-acre empire was gone. The wind had caught the hollowed, insect-ravaged stalks and snapped them at the base. Millions of dollars of genetically perfect wheat lay flattened against the wet earth, a tangled, rotting mat of ruined grain. The destruction was absolute. As far as the eye could see, the Emerald Sea had been turned into a sprawling graveyard. Clara turned slowly to look across the dirt road at her own land. Her field was a wild, towering jungle. The commercial wheat had taken some damage with scattered patches, pushed down by the wind, but the heritage turkey red wheat stood tall and defiant. The old, unengineered genetics of the turkey red possessed thick, robust stems that bent with the gale but refused to break. Furthermore, the tangled vines of the hairy vetch had acted like a biological net, anchoring the base of the wheat stalks and holding them upright against the savage winds. The salad bar, the bird seed, the messy lawn, it was the only field left standing in a 20-mile radius. Harlan walked slowly back to the road. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked hollowed out, much like his wheat. He stopped a few feet from Clara, the mud caked thick on his expensive leather boots. He looked at her wild field, then looked at her. The bank is going to call my loans, Clara. Harlan said, his voice raspy, stripped of all its former arrogance. I've got a fleet of combines arriving next week, and I've got nothing to run them through. Clara didn't gloat. She knew the knife-edge margins of farming too well to take pleasure in another farmer's ruin. I'm sorry, Harlan. Genuinely. Harlan nodded slowly, staring at the tall, swaying stalks of the turkey red. What was it you said? A microclimate. A polyculture, Clara said softly. He let out a dry, bitter laugh. Well, Higgins, let's see if you can actually harvest that jungle. August brought the dry heat needed to cure the grain, and with it the final, seemingly insurmountable hurdle. Growing the polyculture was one thing. Mechanically harvesting a chaotic blend of 3 different plants was a completely different beast. The co-op diner was buzzing again this time, with intense debate over Clara's upcoming harvest. The old-timers argued that her 1998 Case 1H combine would choke on the vetch vines within the first 100 yards. Garrett Dawson warned her that even if she got the grain out of the field, no commercial elevator would accept a hopper full of wheat contaminated with radish seeds and vetch pods. Clara spent the first week of August practically dismantling the guts of her combine. She recalibrated the cylindrical threshing drum to a wider setting so it wouldn't crush the delicate vetch vines, allowing them to pass through the machine intact. She spent hours adjusting the high-speed fans and the oscillating metal sieves, relying on the aerodynamic differences between the crops the heavy wheat berries needed to fall through the grates into the holding tank, while the lighter vetch leaves and radish debris needed to be blown out the back of the combine to return to the soil as organic armor. On the morning of the harvest, a small crowd had gathered on County Road 9. Tyler the drone kid was there with his cameras. Several farmers, including Harlan Miller, leaned against their trucks in silence. Clara climbed into the stifling cab of the Case 1H. Her hands were shaking as she engaged the threshing mechanism. A deep mechanical roar vibrated through the floorboards. She lowered the massive front header, dropping the spinning reel right into the thick, tangled canopy of her field, and pushed the hydrostatic drive lever forward. The combine bit into the jungle. For the first 10 seconds, Clara held her breath, waiting for the sickening sound of a jammed rotor. She watched the reel pull the tall turkey red to the shorter commercial wheat and the vetch directly into the spinning auger. The machine groaned under the heavy intake of biological matter. But it didn't jam. Clara looked back through the rear glass of the cab. A beautiful, chaotic cloud of shredded green vetch and radish leaves was blasting out the back of the chopper, spreading a thick, moisture-trapping mulch back over the soil. Then she looked down at the grain tank window. A steady golden waterfall of heavy wheat berries was pouring into the hopper. The seeds were completely separated from the weeds. It was working. Clara drove the combine back and forth across the fields for 3 grueling days. She didn't stop to sleep. She barely stopped to eat. By the time she finished, her grain bins were overflowing. The final test came when the semi-trucks arrived. She couldn't take her harvest to the local elevator. They would reject the mixed wheat outright. Instead, a sleek, unmarked Peterbilt rolled down her driveway, dispatched by Harrison Cole, the specialty artisanal miller from over the state line. Harrison himself stood by the auger as the golden river of grain poured from Clara's bins into the truck. He scooped up a handful, inspecting the dark, robust kernels of the heritage turkey, red mixed seamlessly with the lighter commercial strain. "I've got sorting machines that will separate these 2 strains by weight back at the mill," Harrison yelled over the roar of the machinery. "The commercial stuff I'll sell off at standard market price, but this turkey red." Do you know what organic bakeries in the city are paying for heritage grain grown without synthetic pesticides right now? "I'm hoping enough to pay off First Midland Bank," Clara yelled back. Harrison grinned, the dust clinging to his sweat. "Clara, you're going to pay off the bank, and you're going to have enough left over to buy a fleet of those shiny green tractors your neighbor drives, though I suspect you won't." By September, the balance sheet of the Higgins farm was firmly in the black for the first time in 15 years. The First Midland Bank stamped her father's catastrophic loans as satisfied in full. Furthermore, because she hadn't spent a single dollar on synthetic fertilizers or emergency organophosphates, her profit margins were completely unheard of in Kettering County. The soil tests came back a week later. The daikon radishes had successfully shattered the hard pan beneath the topsoil, and the decaying vetch was rapidly fixing massive amounts of natural nitrogen into the earth. Her farm was not just surviving, it was healing. In late October, Clara was back at the co-op diner, sitting in her usual booth. The bell above the door jingled, and Harlan Miller walked in. He looked older, tired. The bank had forced him to liquidate 1/3 of his acreage just to cover the chemical bills for the failed harvest. He walked past the counter, pausing for a brief second by Clara's booth. He didn't offer a grand apology, and he didn't ask for her secrets. He simply tapped his knuckles twice against her laminate table, gave a single respectful nod and walked away. Clara took a sip of her coffee, looking out the diner window at the vast, changing landscape. She hadn't just saved her father's farm. She had changed the rules of the dirt forever. Nature always has the last laugh. Clara Higgins proved that sometimes the craziest ideas are the only ones capable of surviving a broken system. When you respect the dirt, it fights for you, when the storm finally hits. If this story of defying the odds and fighting the establishment gave you chills, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to trust their gut. And don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories. Leave a comment below. Would you have the courage to mix the hopper? Let me know.